Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Study of Religions research seminar. This evening we have Dr. Elise Morgenstein Fuerst, who's going to speak to us about Imperial Pandemic, the global racialization of religion. Dr. Morgenstein Fuerst is Associate Professor of Religion and Associate Director of the Humanities Centre at the University of Vermont, and is currently based at the University of Birmingham, UK, as a 2022-2023 Fulbright Award. Her research centres on Islam and Muslims in South Asia, theories and histories of religion, race and language, and imperialism. She is author of Indian Muslim Minorities and the 1857 Rebellion, Religion, Rebels and Jihad, published in 2017. Co-editor of Words of Experience, Translating Islam, with Carl W. Ernst, published by Equinox in 2021. And she's working on two new book projects, Imperial Pandemics on Global Islamophobia and Anti-Semitism, as well as Religion Isn't Done With You, on religion as an inescapable system that shapes our world. She is also the co-host and co-producer of the grant-funded podcast Keeping It 101, A Killjoy's Introduction to Religion. Morgenstein Fuerst has won several Teacher Scholar Awards. So I'm going to pass you over now to Dr. Morgenstein Fuerst. We're very happy to have you here.
Thanks so much. I'm really thrilled to be here. And I will start by saying, please forgive my accent. I am learning in Birmingham that sometimes when I'm tired or a little bit tipsy, I veer too far into Brooklyn, which is where I grew up. And so if at any point I sound like too much of a New Yorker, someone just give me a hand and I will slow down. Though a thing I love about Irish folk is that y'all speak really fast too. So I don't mind. I sometimes feel at home in those accents more than others, but I have been told I'm incomprehensible here. So let me know if that's true. Okay, before we get started, let me just make sure that I thank both Dr. Desandi and Dr. Butler for inviting me, for doing all of the background labor that it takes to host events like this, including listservs and posters and managing tech. All the behind the scenes work is rarely thought about and always undervalued. So it's my practice to value those things at the beginning. And also thank you for those of you to come and listen. This is very much a new project. A few years in the making, but I'm here to do research on it. And so having the opportunity to talk about it in its early phases is an honor and a joy for me. Okay, so I want to talk about this background image. I'm using it in the entire PowerPoint. I'm not awesome at PowerPoints, so don't expect firecrackers here. I'm using a lot of maps and documents in this new project, specifically those from the War Office and the Foreign Office, and I love this map that I'm using as the background. It was issued jointly by the War Office and the Foreign Office in 1932. The map is from what we would now call the interwar period, but was then just the Depression. And everyone the world over was sort of managing unrest, disquiet, the beginnings of fascist movements, as well as in the British Empire, brand new fears about independence movements, pan-Islamism, and uprisings. So we started to see those independence movements gaining momentum in the 1920s and 1930s, and this map was really meant to combat that momentum. It's propaganda. It's a map to show everybody that we're doing great. But relevant to my project and my comments tonight, which is why I'm spending some time on it with you all right now, is that a lot of these maps and their corresponding communiques, press releases, articles really focused on flow and spread, flow and contagion, flow of money, information, goods, flow when it benefited the empire, spread and contagion when it did not. And shocking no one maybe, I'm excited about the second half of that. In this map, there are trade routes, and I realize this might not read on screen so well, but if you were up close, you could see that the labels are concerned with empire. Nearly all of the ports are not labeled with city names, certainly not labeled with local names for places. They are almost always about nationality, who's operating there, and never a place name that you would recognize today. So this isn't new for imperial maps, but it's important nevertheless. So I want to think about why I'm talking about imperial pandemic. And it's both, I think I'm clever, right? I had to apply for a Fulbright. I needed a title to pitch to book editors, and we're in the middle of this pandemic. And so why not capitalize on it? But more importantly, I'm concerned with the racialization of religion, which we're going to get to in a second. I will define all my terms, I promise. In short, in this project, I'm tracing how religio-racialization spread, and specifically spread harmful, hateful ideas about Muslims in 3 case studies: the UK, what's now India, and the US. Tonight, I'm going to speak broadly about the why of this project, and I'm going to touch on the UK and Indian cases briefly. I'm going to skip the US case altogether, just in the interest of time and frankly audience, but I have all those notes with me, and if that's more exciting to you to chat about, let's get to it in the Q&A. In short, I'm really curious in this new project about when, where, and how religions are racialized, and especially how Islam and Judaism's racialization are deeply intertwined and get even more intertwined in this imperial period. I'm curious about how these twin hatreds, which I see as intersecting and parallel at the same time, are contagious insofar as they spread and continue to spread, even as variants pop up locally and contextually. I am most interested in how the mode of that spread was, as the map might indicate, and still is, imperialism, neo-imperialism, neo-colonialism. I started this project like all good projects start. I was doing something else when something new and shiny caught my eye, and I should have been writing the original project. I was, for good measure, in the British Library, as people who study imperialism often do, almost a decade ago, looking for something in the East India office records. It was something about my first book in the racialization of Muslims in British India after the 1857 rebellion. So I'll be honest, I was literally just walking through the stacks in the India office record area because my eyes were blurring from reading these once at one point microfiched and then digitized from the microfiche and super blurry Urdu newspapers. And I just couldn't manage anymore. So I was wandering about, not to lose my spot, and reading. And I found myself paging through a House of Commons record from the early 19th century. I have no idea actually what I was looking for, but in the moment I found in 1813, parliamentarians and officials, economists were panicking, like literally panicking. These are minutes from these meetings, and you've seen your own parliament. You guys yell a lot. And so there was quite a lot of yelling. And they were yelling about what to do now that they had lost access to American cotton and plantations after the War of 1812, or what we call the War of 1812. So much of this panic was not actually about this loss of the American holdings, but actually, how do we translate that loss into more extraction from South Asia? Verbatim, people were saying things like, well, now we need to up the jute production. Now we need to see if cotton will grow outside of Madras, or what is now Chennai, because we can't lose these things outside of New Orleans without gaining them somewhere else in the world. They were about military reassignments. So all of this is happening, and what caught my eye was that one of the concerns about South Asia was that Muslims in particular would be resistant. They would be resistant to more military presence. They would be resistant to working hard in the fields. They would not cow in the way that enslaved Black Americans would. An odd through line kept emerging, though. How would British officials newly in South Asia, often being claimed to be reassigned from the States, how would they know what to do with Muslims who were not a feature of the American South? How would they work and what do we do with all these Muslims, and how do we manage the British officials who would be new to South Asia to manage Muslims? In a few places in these House of Commons meetings, various members of Parliament, before asking or as part of their questions testifying, compared Muslims of India to the Jews of Europe broadly, or more specifically, the Jews of Britain. Sometimes, and you, my colleagues at Cork, might appreciate this, Muslims were directly compared not to Jews, but to the Irish, all of them, with one MP memorably asking if it was true that Muslims were similarly prone to violent outbursts, and if so, could the Irish foreman work with them directly? What was clear in these 19th century questions was that a connection between Jew and Muslim already existed, already served as a script for imagining how these two groups, minorities in Europe and South Asia respectively, could or would serve the British government loyally. Maybe shocking no one in this room, and as I talked about a lot in a lot of my work. British officials really did not see Semites, Muslims and Jews, as capable of being loyal at all, given their assumed loyalties to their own communities first and to the legalisms that they are bound to traditionally. And this narrative should feel familiar to many of you. These are old tropes, especially when we're talking about anti-Semitism. This idea of Jewish dual loyalty or false loyalty is one that far predates the height of the British Empire and certainly the height of modernity. But what I'm interested in is how this dual loyalty or false loyalty trope started to meld with emerging notions of race and language, genes and eugenics, disease and contagion, and religion governing all of it. It is curious, to say the least, that when British officials needed to think critically about Muslim status in South Asia and elsewhere, as we'll get to, they actually started asking questions about Jews. So it is almost as if the guiding question, the Muslim question and the Jewish question, were related. And that's where my research for this new project starts. I'm looking to think, as a starting point, this global history of Semites in some ways. But more specifically, how this idea of a racialized religion that could confound and confuse those of us who know Jews are not Muslims and who know that Judaism and Islam are internally diverse. How did we start to get this terminology that collapses all of those known diversities, internal and external, into one racialized category? So beyond primary source materials from archives and oral history interviews that I'm working on now, I'm utilizing work across a number of fields. And I just want to herald how I'm thinking interdisciplinarily here. So I'm using obviously religious studies, which is my intellectual home, Islamic and Islamophobia studies, Jewish and anti-Semitism studies, South Asian studies, disability studies, critical race and ethnic studies. Those are sort of the big highlighted places that I'm working. And I'm going to name drop a few here so that I don't have to keep citing out loud as we go through, as I'm kind of broadly getting at people. But if these names mean things to you, awesome. Let's talk more about it later. So the folks I'm thinking with and alongside really include Gil Anijar, Amir Mufti, Jonathan Boyarin, Yulia Igorova, Mary Douglas, Indigo Eiling, Anthony Petros, Niluka Gunawardena, and some others. So those are like the people that I'm you shouldn't see my desktop. All the PDFs that are open would embarrass all of us, actually. It would embarrass all of us. You would be embarrassed on my behalf. Those are the folks I'm reading. In short, my project has at its core a genealogical idea, looking to explore how notions of governing Jews translated into ideas about governing Muslims, which also became globally transmitted, not just across the British Empire and the Commonwealth, but to post-colonial states and other empires. I am deeply concerned with how hatreds, frankly, anti-Semitism, sure, but especially contemporary Islamophobia, are part of a hegemony, a system that is undeniably global, as well as having local histories, nuances, and variations. So I'm kind of asking questions about how do we make sense of the similarities in anti-Semitisms and Islamophobias, their shared histories, the way that we have this paper trail of connecting these two things, while also accounting for time and space and difference and context. More to the point, perhaps, how do we make sense of both the history of these ideas as well as their ongoing impacts, their connections and divergences, and what might it tell us that there's a script in place for Christianity's others as empire's others in an imperial period that leads to a post-imperial period that shows us that the effects of colonization aren't done with us. Which I think gives me a space to talk about the questions I think we need to ask and answer tonight to make some sense of what's going on. So before I dive too deeply, I want to sketch out this project a little bit, so bear with me. I guess this is where I show you my chops. I did archival and field research most recently in Delhi in 2019. It was supposed to be a setup research for a fellowship I had for summer of 2020, which obviously did not materialize given the pandemic. But in 2019, I spent about 9 weeks in Delhi, which is where I've spent most of my time researching, in the National Archives. And while I was in the archives, I was asking questions about law, Islam, and to be very, very general, any kind of policy, whether that was local or national, about how Muslims fit or don't fit into national identities. So in the news today, you might see things like sacred cow laws and looking at policies like that over a 150-year period of time. While I was in Delhi, I also did a lot of field research, and I was focusing, oddly enough, or you might think this is odd, I thought it was kind of smart at the time, and now I have questions about my own thought pattern. I was doing walking tours of massacres, rebellion sites, and other places that martyrs to the nation state were memorialized in and around Delhi. I was comparing and contrasting how walking tour guides presented the information across languages. So I took those tours in English, German, French, Urdu, and Hindi with a variety of guides and of companies on independence. It's kind of like a wild experience. And I was curious about how we were talking about grave sites, for example, of Muslim martyrs, or obelisks to Muslims as opposed to Hindus, and how we would present the nation's identity around memorialization. One of the things that was really interesting there was that different languages produce different understandings of nation, and specifically different understandings of Muslim belonging. And those understandings of Muslim belonging both did and did not line up with the understanding of Muslims as uniquely responsible for rebellion. In a contemporary moment, Muslims were found to be written out, just not part of that history anymore, because they can't be heroes of a nationalistic India. That's antithetical to a current understanding of Muslims in India. So that was part one. And here in the UK, for this case study, I'm revisiting archival work that I did completely remotely during the pandemic. Thank God for digitization and good friends. And those questions are also around law, policy, and the kind of semi-ethnographic work of the colonial and imperial period, especially those that demonstrate how Muslims were imagined as a cogent and monolithic whole. That's kind of my whole thing. While in Birmingham, I am working on oral histories with multi-generational South Asian Muslims, where I'm asking questions and having conversations about identity, race, religion, and nation. So the big theoretical questions are about transmission, global patterns, and local variants. And so to get at these ideas, I think what I'm going to do this evening is sort of talk about, what do we mean by racialized religion? Why do we care about imperialism? Like, what is an American doing here? Why am I really focusing on theories of contagion, which I think is where I've gotten the most pushback and where I feel like I'm on to something the most? And what's at stake? Or to put it kind of bluntly, who cares? Like, who cares about these historical questions? Okay, so what do we mean when we talk about racialized religion? So I'm going to read a little bit more. Racialization marks individuals as having immutable traits because of their membership in a particular group. The concept and construct of race includes a sexualization of groups based on traits that are imagined to be inherent, hereditary, and prognostic, which is to say, rooted in ideas of biology. I am hesitant to call these real biological features because we know that race science is based on malarkey. Racialization is the process through which a group is made or marked as a race. It is the process through which we make individuals as both belonging to one cogent group as well as marking them as possessing inherent hereditary and prognostic characteristics. I'm obsessed with the prognostic piece, and we'll come back to that. Race is complicated, obviously, especially in metropoles of empire or in diaspora communities, particularly because of all these nuances. Religions are, of course, not races, but religions are and have been racialized. Judaism and Islam are two such religions. They are complicated, and some scholars would be quick to point out that Judaism is an ethno-religion, given its status as both an ethnicity and a religion, but some of us might push back and suggest that ethno-religions and ethno-religious ideologies exist within larger, broader religions like Islam, where language, region, culture, and ancestry are primary markers of belonging and might even supersede issues like belief or practice. The racialization of religion really refers to how these groups are seen and portrayed as having these inherent characteristics. And we might think of those as pseudo-biological. So things like nose shape or hair type. Other things, though, that I am more excited about or interested in are stereotypes made biological. So following early race science, things that linger with us, like imagining a given group's industriousness or loyalty or legalism. All of those don't sound biological to our ears, but starting in the 19th century, absolutely were. And we still see the effects of that today. Because these ideas don't play with common sense. For example, we've seen the collapse of Islam into a great monolith where knowing someone's name is all we need to know about them. So if someone's name sounds or appears Muslim, it might be all a law enforcement officer needs to know something about that individual based on perceptions of the group. And that is regardless of whether that person's skin color matches another person in that group's skin color. So often, especially in the United States, we're obsessed with race as a color binary without really imagining that brown, black, white folks can all be racialized into one uniform group. And that is the case with Islam particularly. So the way I often talk about this when I talk with students is that an American comedian named Ahmed said just after 9/11 that no amount of telling the government that he doesn't go to mosque, loves beer, and loves bacon will dissuade the government that he is anything but Muslim because his parents named him Ahmed. He famously jokes that he can't get on a plane with that name without getting hassled first, even if he was carrying a martini to the security gate. It's not just stereotyping. It is the racialization of religion. He cannot opt out of Islam. He can't opt out, even though in Christian-centered spaces, which is frankly all of Europe and America, opting in and opting out, having belief be the driving force of our belonging, doesn't apply to Muslims. Mr. Ahmed's assumed religion isn't a religion at all because it's involuntary. It is about inherited traits, an inherited trait that is prognostic of behavior. And in this case, the prognosis is violence, right? This is what Dr. Judith Weisenfeld calls religio-racialization. And I think it helps us get at the problem of how we understand racial categories as both being part of and distinct from how religion can be racialized, how we can wipe out internal diversity in favor of naming something as one functional race. Which brings me to, why do we care? Frankly, this matters because, for all of these intersectional problems you can imagine, all of the ways that folks struggle with racism in their universes and their lives, and the way all of us operate within systems of white Christian supremacy, race science and the science of religion are developed concurrently in conversation with each other, and frankly, often by the same authors, and they are part and parcel sponsored by the empire. And I know it's a bold look for an American to come tell scholars housed in Ireland that we need to care about imperialism. I know you know. I have seen Irish Twitter. Y'all roast the empire better than anybody else. But here in England, and definitely at home in the States, you would think, given the reaction to critiques of empire, of very conservative, even moderate folks, that I'm saying something that's truly outlandish. But the thing is that religio-racial categories established during imperialism weren't limited to the UK, they weren't limited to the colonies. This map that I'm using shows you the map, not just of the flow of goods, but the spread of ideas. And imagining that these ideas and roots disappeared just because the map maker's bosses changed is kind of silly. We know that colonial era laws are still on the book in many, if not most, but I haven't done the long division to check, post-colonial states. That's absolutely the case in South Asia. Many British laws rely on ideas about others developed in the imperial period, and I'm thinking here of scholar Nadine El-Anani's recent book, Bordering Britain, which makes an incredibly compelling case that almost all British law is irrevocably shaped by the racial categories of imperialism. And she does this tracing immigration law, housing law, and citizenship laws. It's a great book. So imperialism matters, not just because it was this violent historical regime that did violence around the world and left scars on people's bodies, but also because it plays with these theories of contagion that I'm really interested in. So The question I got when I applied for this Fulbright was, oof, theories of contagion. It sounds like you're dabbling in eugenics. And okay, that would be a look. So I promise I'm not doing that. The archives I use in the UK and India primarily are full of evidence, just like chock-a-block of documents that show British officials, often in conversation or even partnership, however asymmetrical, with local informants, thought learning something in one corner of the empire was transmittable to other countries, and they use the language of transmission. So as but one example, in the 1860s and 70s, there's a number of gazetteers and documents that come to circulate from India, specifically Calcutta or Kolkata and Benares and Varanasi, about how to govern Muslims. These documents quickly make their way to other British colonized spaces, and either Muslim majorities or where Muslims are either majorities or significant minorities, we see officials passing laws or suggesting policies citing the original sources. So things that were developed in India start to be cited in Nigeria, Egypt, Iraq in the early 20th century as proof texts, which is to say that ideas developed in South Asia about South Asian Muslims in two cities are using race theory and racialized religions as the backdrop for how to govern Muslims around the world. They are a monolithic whole. In the interest of time, I'm not going to delve too much more into that, but I want to think about how transmission and contagion works. I think with theories of contagion, because British officials were frankly obsessed with it, there's not a document I've read that doesn't in some way get at disease, contagion, spread, transmission, virality, cancer. Cancer comes later, but so in previous work, I've worked on the Indian Penal Code, and specifically I've worked on the Contagious Disease Act. In that piece where I wrote about both, I was thinking about religion and race and gender and how it took on new lives in legal statuses. So in the archive and these preliminary oral histories and memorialization projects I've got going in North India and Delhi, these ties are really obvious. So sometimes it was literal. British officials were intent, sometimes correctly and incorrectly, on proving that Muslim movement, especially around pilgrimages, was causing cholera outbreaks. So the British became obsessed that every outbreak of cholera, which they brought to India, was actually about Muslim pilgrimage. So should we not allow Muslims to go to dargahs or tomb sites? Should we not allow Muslims to go on Hajj? Because they will inevitably bring back disease. It was all about control, but a very real and pressing understanding of disease, and specifically cholera. But then you have this Contagious Diseases Act, which more or less targeted sex workers, but in literature, we're talking about prostitutes, but I'm going to use the language of sex workers. And people were really racist with the application of these laws. So Muslim women were not a minority, were not a majority of sex workers in South Asia, but Muslim women were often over prosecuted for CDA violations. And in some documents, they were described as uniquely responsible for spreading sexually transmitted infection because of their Muslimness. In the early 20th century, as British officials worried more and more about pan-Islamism and global rebellion, we see all of these statements in written work and in recorded meetings, physically recorded meetings, not tape recorded meetings, where the Muslim leaders are described as spreading their ideas. Their ideas are recorded as contagious, preying on the vulnerable, making sick minds, and more. So several of the sources I'm working with that liken pan-Islamism to disease, and in letters between Dutch and British colonizers in India and Indonesia, the term disease appears on like every page, frequently when referring to Muslims, pan-Islamism, and the fear of uprising across these two colonial powers. So folks in competition for, say, for example, Singapore, were literally sending communications back and forth about how they were worried about the disease of Muslim uprising. In later British and Indian documents, especially around the time of the global rise of fascism in the 20s and 30s, and a fixation among some Hindu leaders whose political parties would later become the ruling elite of India today, so like the RSS, the BJP, the VHP, and within anti-Semitic policies in Third Reich Germany, we see even more evidence of Muslims referred to in terms that reflect germ theory: disease, cancer, invasive, threat, virus. So the idea, of course, here is that Muslims were a threat to the body politic. And I'm lingering on the body here because it matters. Obviously, in more classical Western thought, the state or empire is a human body, which is where we get the phrase body politic, which means it can only tolerate, the body politic can only tolerate so much disease, so much illness before it collapses. And this is, to be blunt, where the operating critiques of how we do things like diversity, equity, and inclusion today, which preach tolerance, is just wrong, because the history of that is about how much poison can we handle before we can handle no more. It's not really acceptance or inclusion. It's also that model of governance that we see in British Empire with respect to Muslims, and I would argue less obviously in the colonies than in Britain itself, Jewishness. So further, it's the model that we see in India today under Hindutva in their anti-Muslim policies, and it's a model that I recognize in the States as well, among many other places. This idea of a sick body as the body politic as one thing only, and of religio-racial others as a threat, not just to the stability of the nation, but to its health, its very existence, is one that undergirds, frankly, quite a lot of governmental regimes, and it's the most obvious in this imperial period. Theories of contagions help us also think about the obverse, though, and this is where I'm kind of playing recently, and I promise I'm almost done. I know we started a little bit late, but I want to make sure there's time for questions. I'm lingering on this disease because it makes me uncomfortable, but I do think we can ask some questions that are helpful. So like, how did this model of religio-racialization become the norm? How did it spread and infect the world? How did this virus change in new environments? What are its morphologies? I like that this sounds gross and to sound really smart, icky. I'm not asking that we reclaim some of the most brutal genocidal language and turn it on its head. I don't think we can reclaim the master's tools. I don't think that works. But I do think in the midst of a literal global pandemic, contagion theories feel both relevant and apt, right? So in my work in 2019, it was pretty clear that the current Indian government is not the former British Empire. But its virulent anti-Muslim hostility is both a local variant of this global disease, and it is one that is both unique and common. So I'm working out how to tie all my case studies together neatly in this coherent book while I'm here in Britain, but sorry, in the UK. But the truth is I'm seeing and hearing more and more references to illness, disease, virus, cancer, the more I look. So the more I see it, I know that there's a confirmation bias there, but the more I look for it, the more it's there. And so I'm curious about how we can think about transmittability. Why do we see ideas about Muslims as a cogent whole look the same in places like Nigeria, Egypt, Iraq, India, and Indonesia, and the United States, when all of those places have radically different racial histories, contexts, languages, histories, etc.? So I think there's a there, and I think there's something worth exploring. And I think there's a there for loads more reasons than just, hey, this is important. I think when we think about the stakes, I'm slammed, like physically, it feels painful to say that both anti-Semitic and Islamophobic attacks are as high as they have ever been since the mid-20th century. My project is placing religio-racialized hostilities in conversations, tracing how European and especially British imperialism spread both anti-Jewish and anti-Muslim sentiment using each other as blueprints. The central narrative of this imperial pandemic project is focusing on Islam and Muslims, just given our contemporary location. So here's some data. Islamophobic rhetoric, violence, and laws are having an unprecedented rise around the world by every metric and in every country we are measuring. Anti-Muslim hate crimes are at their highest point since 9/11 2001 in North America. In Europe, Muslim advocacy groups document a similar spike in Islamophobic incidents, including, but not limited to, anti-burqa laws, targetings of Muslims by police, and so-called commonplace incidents of harassment, where the numbers are off the chart. In Asia, we're seeing the oppression and ethnic cleansing of Muslim ethnic groups like Uyghurs and Rohingya, as well as anti-Muslim legislation and pogroms in North India. In Oceania, we're seeing anti-Muslims attacked with increasingly, startlingly in the last decade. So put simply, there's an epidemic of anti-Muslim hate manifesting the world over. And if you layer that with anti-Semitism, we see another twin epidemic. My work is trying to pay attention to first the historical roots of this religio-racialization, and second, how these sites that I'm playing with, India, the UK, and the US, though I didn't talk about that today, illuminate how racialized religion becomes anti-Muslim hostility, anti-Jewish hostility, but is informing and exacerbating one another like a circle. So I think we need to put Islamophobia in a global framework. It's not enough to just say, in my backyard, here's what's happening. Here's the local leaders I'm working with. Here are the solidarities I'm building. I think we need to think about things like inoculation against the legacies of colonial modernity. If we miss that religions are racialized, we're fundamentally misunderstanding and can't properly address racialized religious hatred like Islamophobia and anti-Semitism. It becomes something special, something we can't really deal with, and it becomes antithetical to thinking about anti-Black racism as one example. So I'm curious about the language of disease mitigation. I'm interested in thinking about racism as a virulent, centuries-long pandemic of epic proportion that continues to morph and change and evolve. So if we think about inoculation, what do we do with our communities and how do we prevent against it? I think we can't do it without talking about religion. So I'm hoping that in Imperial Pandemic, I can show both how this process works, how these ideas were spread, how these local morphologies function, but also so that we can expect local variations without absolving the entire system, this primary bug from which it all stems. You can't cure one part of a body. How about I end there? I had a little bit more, but why don't I end there so that we have enough time for questions? Again, I know we started late, but I don't want to talk forever. Thanks, and sorry.
Thanks so much, Dr. Morgenstein Fuerst. So we'll open the floor for questions so people can put up their hand. You'll see the hand icon there with raise. So you just press that if you want to put up your hand, or you can type in the chat if you like.
Perfect, I'll open the chat.
So Aditi, you're the first with your hand up.
Thanks.
Yeah, am I audible?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for this session. So I had this question that, I'm myself from Delhi in India. So what are the phenomena that you're talking about? I've seen how the Islamophobia or anti-Muslim policies of the current government has been into place. So I was just wondering that, is it like something that have to do with the legacy of imperialism, or is it the history of Muslim or per se in India that have led to what the policies are for in today's world and all? So that's my question.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. It's a good one. It's a complicated one. And so, like most annoying faculty, I will say it's both and. There's obviously a local history to anti-Muslim hostility in North India in particular. But a lot of that hostility is traceable. We can find the moments where Muslims and Hindus were pitted against each other, like literally financially rewarded or incriminated for ways that under British legacy and British rule. And I think that quite a lot of scholars would point to the ways that religion gets codified legally. So before religion was codified legally in the Indian Constitution, and before that, the British system, and especially the Indian Penal Code, we just didn't see the same amount of hostility. We didn't see the same amount of grumpiness between these two groups, and we saw quite a lot more fluidity. Now, that doesn't mean that everything was peaceful and some sort of like pre-British utopia. I don't think that's true at all. Nor am I seeking to remove agency from the contemporary hateful actors, right? Like the leaders of the Hindutva movement are not British. They're not. So I'm not trying to remove their agency, but I do think that placing the historical context in which the narrative shifted from one of complex composite religious communities to ones of cantankerous, hostile, bickering is something that we can literally point to. There are historical moments where we can say, here's the timeline of how this unfolded, and here's how British law fundamentally restructured how people acted with each other. Now, you might garner that I'm obsessed with law because it's a material way that we can prove that it just changes how people behave in public. And so I hope that's not too inadequate of a question. And if they're interested, I can probably send you lots of bibliographic information on where to read more about those kinds of arguments. But thank you for your question.
Thank you so much. It helped me a lot. Yeah.
Nahar, you're the next. Your hand up.
Thank you. Hi, Elise.
Hi, Sahar. Thanks for coming.
It's lovely to see you, and thank you so much for this really fascinating talk. I think my question is really sort of thinking of the way when we think about, and I would love your input on this, because clearly imperialism has had its claws in all parts of the world, in all sorts of areas, and when we see the way the British imperial system racialized religions, at least I'm wondering how you feel the paradigm that you're working with can be applied to now, for example, Muslim majority countries that were also colonized and also very much have the same sort of systems embedded in them. But perhaps because they're Muslim majority countries themselves, we don't necessarily view them with the same way because they're the majority themselves. And I would just love to hear your thoughts on how we can perhaps imprint what you're talking about into that context.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I have to be honest, I wrestled with including places like Indonesia, Malaysia, and a few North African countries. But to be honest with you, it's my own lack, right? So my languages are what my languages are. My training is what my training is. And I found it was just too complicated to make the project bigger. But if I were to task someone else, the questions that I would want to ask, they would always be about law for me. I mean, really, it's like, where do we have the leftovers? Where in the Egyptian constitution, for example, are we seeing holdovers from British mandate? Where are we getting rewards? So I'm thinking here of the work of Ryan Thum and of Christian Peterson, who have done really important work on Islam in China and are thinking about global policy and how global policy is changing internal policy. So for example, Christian Peterson I actually don't know if it's out yet, but I read a pre-publication, I helped him read. I was a reader for one of his articles about how the Chinese racial categories, especially around Muslim ethnic minorities, bear with me as I try to get this right because I'm not a China expert, are doing so with reflection on US foreign aid in a post 9/11 universe, which prioritizes the war on terror. And so America and China do not have good foreign relations. We do not have awesome diplomacy. We being Americans, consistently throw China out when it suits us, right? Like we have a real xenophobia thing happening. And yet the two countries sort of agree that the war on terror is really important, and they use it as this backdrop for making in-kind policy changes. And we see a lot of money going back and forth around it. And so America is in some ways a post-British place, and in other ways is its own inheritor of the throne of the British Empire, one could make that claim. And China is its own imperial space, but we still see that footprint of Muslims as racialized, Muslims as one thing operating in this global scale. So that's kind of who I'm thinking of to answer your question. I think there are ways to apply it and think about it, but what we always need is more nuanced histories. And I'm always interested in policy questions, but that doesn't mean that's the only way to ask it. I hope that helped. That felt rambly.
So Cass.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I am also from New York, and like I've seen the increase of hate crimes and those type of things that have been happening to Muslims and Jewish people there. Often, like you said, in tandem. Are you focusing on like hate crimes or the uptick of harm to these communities that have happened really recently at all in your research?
Yes. So the oral history piece in India was about these walking tours and how people are constructing national belonging, and flip-flopping this narrative on when Muslims belong and when Muslims are heroes and when they're not. In the UK, I'm working, honestly, I just got here. So I'm trying to set up conversations about nation belonging. I'm calling it citizenship, but that's a really American framework. And history, right? So I'm in Birmingham. This is this incredible city with tons of South Asian history for like 250, 300 years. And yet you still have people talking about being immigrants. And even though their family has been here like longer than my family's been in the United States, which I understand is a British American difference, but to get at your question, the contemporary thing I'm thinking about is what do modern policies, like what does Brexit mean to this group of people? What do we think about all these new visa restrictions, right? Like I could talk for days about the new visa restrictions on Fulbright scholars. It's fascinating and bizarre and interesting. And in the States, I'm thinking about how Jews and Muslims are one of the only groups of people that we actually consider dual loyal in the US. So we do it sometimes to particular Asian American groups, but other than that, it's only Jews and Muslims that are considered having dual loyalties in the United States. And there's a very particular legal history that you can trace when Jews and Muslims were allowed to be citizens. And every time the cases are about whether they would be able to follow American law. And I am using a lot of contemporary examples. So I have spent way too much time in the comment sections of like neo-Nazi websites and very right-wing, usually evangelical churches that talk about how frighteningly, how Jews and Muslims are really in bed with each other and are working together as part of like a global cabal to overthrow the government. So I'm doing all of that contemporary stuff. The United States example feels more complicated because there is a lot of evidence in early US history and up to the mid 20th century that the United States was really looking to Britain as an example of how to treat of how to think globally about leadership with minorities in mind. So we have a lot of documents around that. It's harder to connect it to the more contemporary stuff because America kind of goes nuts after World War II and does its own thing. So I'm not entirely sure where that case study is going yet. I know there's a there, but I haven't threaded it together. And now that I'm here doing this work, I've sort of let that sit on the back burner. But I'm absolutely interested in the contemporary stuff. Yeah. Thanks for that question.
Thanks. That was super informing.
So we have time for one last question or comment, if there's any more. Brendan?
I can just get my machine on, yeah. Yeah, so thank you so much. That was so fascinating and so interesting. And I couldn't help but thinking of Elise's comment about Irish entanglement with this spread of this contagion, colonized, but also colonizer. The great Wahhabi trial, which was about the contagion of unfounded concern around Wahhabi ideas. The prosecutor in that trial is James O'Keneally, an Irish Catholic from Cavan, and the defense lawyer is a guy called Dunbar, a Protestant Irish guy from Dublin. So it's quite interesting in terms of anyway Irish contributions to all of that. I just wondered, maybe as a final question, if you're conceptualizing it in terms of contagion, what does inoculation look like then?
It's a great question. This is where I feel both like a pie in the sky liberal, which I would never describe myself as, but I do think education is part of it. I mean, you know, I keep reading the news from at home. It's nice not to be in the States right now. Honestly, it's like delightful. Not that I'm not concerned with all the nonsense happening here, but you know, Florida just banned books, like all of them. So I don't know if you all are following, but the state of Florida under Governor DeSantis just said all books in all public school libraries need to be approved one at a time, and that all books had to be removed from public school libraries until things were approved. Okay, neat. So I am always curious when people ban books, right? Like if we don't want education, then education's a key, but how do we deal with that? So I do think education's part of inoculation, but I do think also it's beefing up some of the projects we're already working on. I know I had a throwaway line about diversity, equity, inclusion, which is what we call, I think you flip around some of the words, equity, diversity, and inclusion, maybe. Because I go to these meetings all the time, and religion is never part of the conversation in the United States. It's never part of the conversation. It's a throwaway. It's a get an interfaith calendar and put it on the university calendar with a link. Or it's these ecumenical interfaith conversations where we're still like, you know, there's 14 different varieties of Christian. It's like a mixed jelly bean bag. And then like the Jew, the Muslim, maybe some other Asian religion, maybe, but probably not. And so I think really beefing up the work we're doing there and allowing the people who are doing the good work to do it ideally without burnout and without racist remunition, I think that's part of that inoculation. I think some of it too, and this would probably honor my like Bolshevik ancestry. Some of it too is just throwing some of the systems that are broken out, right? Like I think some of it's like radical revision. I'm not sure we can only fix institutions by thinking institutionally. And so some of that's about I am a big proponent of democratizing information. I like being an expert. I like having my job. I like giving talks to rooms like this. But I also want to be involved in public scholarship, community knowledge base, and grassroots movements where my expertise is maybe not as expert as someone else who's doing this work in more direct ways. So that's like I think a lofty set of answers, but I don't know that I have the answers. I want to be part of asking the questions.
Perfect answer. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Emma?
Thanks. I was waiting for the go-ahead from the chair. Elise, I want to thank you on behalf of the department, and I think I speak you know, from the wider university. You're speaking to several sections of the university's work today here at the Study of Religions, the Equality, Diversity, Inclusion Unit, the Race Equality Forum, and also it is World Interfaith Harmony Week, which is set up by the United Nations. It's important to note that that document actually talks about interfaith work centrally located with an idea of a God, which again is very restrictive. And you've done this in many of your podcasts and many of your work when it comes to talking about religions. And it's just so important to kind of bring all these different intersections together. Today is also St. Bridget's Day here in Ireland. You know, it's a Gaelic kind of traditional festival where St. Bridget is Ireland's patroness saint, if I could say that, but it's also the kind of the intersections of looking at kind of Indigenous Ireland, paganism, and so much more. So I just wanted to thank you for taking us on a journey, which is kind of bringing all this together. And at some level, it's giving me a lot of hope for the future, you know, scholarship and work in when it comes to the study of religions, which often kind of separates a lot of what you've said, and kind of reduces it often when it comes to talking about race and or interfaith. So that's a huge thank you note to you for doing this. I'm just, my also apology is that we couldn't get you here in person, but I do hope that we can get you here to Cork soon. And and I know Birmingham is probably treating you extremely well. Can you say a little bit about the interviews that you're having with the kind of the community in Birmingham?
Yeah, that's great. And thank you, Aman. I thank you. That feels too generous to put my work in that light, but I agree with you completely. I think religious studies often wants to articulate itself in one way, especially as it comes under fire from others, right? Especially we see a devaluing of the humanities, we see a devaluing of folks who work on literature or texts or things that feel less scientific. And I get that defensive move, but I think interdisciplinarity makes us stronger, and I think it makes us better advocates, right? Like arguing from the intersections makes us smarter scholars, but it also means we're doing more holistic work, whatever that is, whether that's publishing in, Cambridge journals or whether that's giving a talk at your corner church. I think both of those things are valuable. The work I'm doing here, and I'm in Birmingham until July, and after many fights with the Home Office, I now have a visa where I can leave the country more than once without being arrested. So that's exciting. Anyway, we could talk about being an immigrant some other time. Not a real immigrant, but my paperwork, it was a wild journey, y'all. So the interviews I'm doing here are meant to think about multi-generational, the way that multi-generational Muslims in particular, though I'm kind of talking with folks who will talk to me, belonging and where they feel like they fit either within England or within Britain. So we talk a lot about diaspora, but I'm curious about the relationship between home and away. And I'm especially curious about how folks relate to place. This is one of these communities that is so old, frankly. And I know I'm an American, so I think everything's old, like if it's older than 50 years, but this is a community that can really trace itself like through India office records to like the late 1700s. And yet you hear officials, mostly white community members, and even some Muslim community members talk about themselves as new arrivals, even when they are not. So it's not that some folks are new arrivals. It's like, we're new here, we're not quite British. And I'm curious about that not quite British question as it relates to how people self-articulate racially and religiously. That's being vague, but I'm kind of starting with these oral histories of like, tell me the story of your family, tell me why Birmingham, tell me what neighborhood you're in, tell me how this has gone for you, and then tell me the relationship you have too. And I've got like a list of keywords, right? It's like Pakistani, Indian, South Asian, Desi, British, English, diaspora. And I've been here for 2 weeks, so I'm not fully settled yet. And I've had 5 conversations. 2 of them were wildly bizarre, like just in the way that interviews can be. 2 of them were obsessed that I was a Jewish person from New York. And so the conversation just ended up being about me. And we have another conversation set up for another time. And one conversation really did this really interesting work where it was like, I relate to being English in this way. I relate to being British in this way. I don't relate to being Pakistani or Indian, but I do feel some connection to Desi. I don't feel these ways when I'm in public, but I feel these ways in private. And then thinking about how that relates to imperial definitions. Like, do these words fit you? Do you feel like that represents your family history? And one of the groups I'm working with are a group of both veterans and descendants of veterans. It's like a strange setup of World War II folks who both had and didn't have essentially like British citizenship. So I have some old man. I'm talking with very old men in the next couple of weeks, and we'll see how that goes. I feel like it'll be really strange, but I'm excited to see how people relate to their place and how they feel their place is within it.
Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry,
Thanks
that was
so much.
long-winded.
I must go because I'm teaching the women's studies in the ME. But thank you so much. Thank you, Jenny, for chairing as always.
And there's a comment from Nuala in the chat who says, thank you for so generously sharing your research with us, Elise. It has been fascinating, particularly appreciate the insights on the contradictions of EDI work. So I think we all enjoyed your talk, and thank you for telling us about your research. So I will just end the recording now. Stop the recording.